Our final speaker today is David Martin. David is a registered architect and sustainability strategist who has provided over 12 years of volunteer subject matter expertise to Standards Australia in the rapidly emerging fields of climate change, adaptation and urban green infrastructure through active roles in Australian Standard 5334 2013 and more recently HB 214 2023. David brings unique skills in a whole of government policy development through volunteer work with local government organisations, everyday role working in the state agency and community of practice networking skills with federal agencies and professional affiliations. Today, David's going to be talking about the new Standards Australia National Handbook for Urban Trees and Infrastructure. And you're best switched on because we're also going to be giving away these things at the end of David's talk. So let's just ask David to come up. Any questions?
First of all, just to correct the record, I'm a registered landscape architect. I'm not a registered architect. And today I'm actually talking to you more from my role with the Institute of Landscape Architects. My day job is at the Sydney Olympic Park Authority. I'm a registered landscape architect, that's my fancy title. But really the work that I've been doing for over a decade now has been on behalf of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, working with Standards Australia on standards, and what I'm going to talk to you now on is a handbook. First of all, I guess acknowledgements of country. Yes, I also acknowledge the traditional custodians and knowledge keepers on the land that we're meeting today. But importantly, I also want to acknowledge Ben Gooden for being so generous to host this event, Citygreen, Wesrock, of course, for also supporting it, and Penrith City Council. And I should say before I really launch into my presentation that it was that certain professional tipping point day of almost reaching 50 degrees. And the great thing that Penrith Council hosted in January 2020 is when I met Dr. Sebastian Fausch. So it was sort of fortuitous that we did have that sort of pretty hot period, and being the hottest place on the planet made things happen. And 3 years later, the National Handbook for Urban Green Infrastructure has been born. So thank you, Penrith Council, and thank you, Dr. Fausch. I know he's not here, but we'll talk more about other people that contributed to the handbook in a minute. So where the shade hits the pavement, great topic. And I'm just going to go through, I'm not going to give you a lengthy, this is really just a bit of a snapshot presentation. I do have the last gig. I think Ben promised me that all those cameras up there, one would be the ABC, and it's promised me it's going to be on the nightly news tonight at 7 o'clock, so I hope that's true. So if you're all still awake and you love talking about standards and handbooks, which is never really a great thing, but funnily enough, it's coming from a design person. So here it is. This is the new document. You're going to see this later. We're going to give away some copies. It's a new handbook, and the quote there that we have from Ben Stockwin, which was something that in 2020 we had to do a scoping study to convince the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, which is the super peak body of engineers, architects, planners, landscape architects, property council, green building council, all the universities that train all those built environment professionals. They had to be convinced during 2020 that this had industry and sector-wide support. So the line that was developed by Ben and I was taking urban green infrastructure from the nice to have to the must have. And I think that's an underlying thing that I'm hearing from all speakers today. I was at a conference only 10 days ago run by the Fifth Estate, attended by a similar number of people. It wasn't so much a local government audience, but it was people from property, insurance, finance, also all wanting to make sure that we can accelerate the delivery of urban green infrastructure. And I think this handbook is a key step at a federal level. So we're going to go from a local government level, and we can sort of show how Penrith Council is really driving national policy. At the moment, there's an absence. If you look in the policy pyramid, and you've read all the green infrastructure strategies that I have, there's nothing at the top of the tree. The only thing that is the Australian Climate Change Adaptation Standard, which came out 10 years ago, where green infrastructure was recognised as a sector. Probably a lot of you don't know that, but it's been sitting there, and occasionally I get on projects now where people are using the climate change adaptation standard. So it's really starting to sort of go through into big consortia, big infrastructure projects. And it now, I think the linked up conversations that we're having is more evidence of that. So that definition on the left-hand side is actually what's in the Australian Climate Change Adaptation Standard. So you can see it's very comprehensive, very broad. There's a sort of, it's a bit fuzzy, I apologise for that, but here's the cover of the standard. So AS 5334-2013, this is now the go-to standard used right across industry and government for looking at climate risk. And it's a principle-based standard based on ISO 31000, and it's got a definition of under settlements and infrastructure, so green infrastructure is there. So it does have that gravitas, it does have that recognition that's been there for 10 years, but now we need to really ramp up and start to leverage the handbook that has spun off this document. And you might say, what is a handbook? We've had Adrian today saying he's got a playbook, he's thinking at a global level, I'm thinking at a national and whole of government level, both in my day job at state government agency. I volunteer on the local sustainability reference group where I live, and I'm involved with CSIRO and other federal government agencies through my pro bono voluntary work. But a handbook is, this is only a 30-page document. It's the best 30 pages you'll spend. It's about $3 a page. Considering the subject matter experts that have gone into this document, and I'll share with you the people that come. So it's meant to be a lower consensus document than a standard. You would probably know technical standards for trees. I mean, Ross was talking about his work, and that's now permeated into technical standards. And the thing about standards is they eventually are enforceable, or they can be principles-based. A handbook is just the first step towards getting into mandated standards. So I think it's taken 3 years to get this document up, but now the door is open for industry to push for technical standards relating to green infrastructure. So it was industry and sector-led. It's, as I said, can lead to mandatable standards, and we're trying to go from the nice to have to the must have. So I was very pleased to see that even though the planning community is not the dominant number in the audience, there's still a significant number of planners here. And talking to my colleague that I came in the car today, who is a planner, that we really want planners and engineers as professionals to take up and be the champions for green infrastructure. It's sort of come out of the horticulture, landscape architecture, soils space and science community, but we really think that the key to mainstreaming and seeing much more funding going into blue and green infrastructure is by working on a federal policy, which we currently don't have. So it's not necessarily for the people in this room to, the document's really probably for policy people who might have heard about green infrastructure. They might have been confused. Is it about wind turbines and solar? No, it's not clean energy. It's about living, growing infrastructure. So the definitions, and I'm not going to show you every page, but why did we do the handbook? So Sebastian stole my line this morning. If you look at the policy pyramid, there's nothing at the top except that one Australian standard around recognition in the Climate Change Adaptation Standard. There's a total absence in Canberra of any recognition of green infrastructure. Having said that, you do have federal bodies like Infrastructure Australia that are recognising green infrastructure, and you've got other groups like Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, ISCA, that have green rating tools, but there still isn't any official policy coming from our federal government. And I clearly think that's a great opportunity for people in this room to maybe say, look, this is what's coming out of grassroots local government and some really good stuff in state government. How can we influence the federal government to be recognising this sector and this asset class and helping to co-fund bundles of blue and green infrastructure that will probably come back to benefit many local governments, particularly people like Penrith, who are feeling the heat, so to speak. During the scoping study in 2020, we had Ian Shears. I think some of you would know Ian Shears was the former head of the urban forestry team at City of Melbourne. Sebastian was involved and a few other people. And Ian said, look, we need to create a more level playing field. We do have very good local government leadership from City of Melbourne, City of Sydney, Penrith Council, but it soon falls off. Maybe Adelaide you could talk about, possibly Darwin, but there's a lot of inconsistency even just at the local government sector. State government, you've got really good stuff happening probably in Victoria and New South Wales, but really not much happening in other states. And at the federal level, there's nothing. So we're trying to, with the handbook, provide a level playing field with common language. More consistent language is key, and people that understand, are we all talking about the same thing? So when I talk about the Dummies Guide, it's really generic language. There's a whole glossary and definitions section that Associate Professor Stephen Lisley worked on with me, and we really put down very simple, generic descriptions of what makes up our sector to avoid a lot of the confusion. We also had a key involvement from, I know that Philip Grouse was here today representing PIA. One of the most important sections, and I do have a slide coming up, is the planning framework and the planning touch points. Where does green infrastructure have touch with planning processes? So we had the National Policy Officer of PIA, John Brockhoff, who talked 10 days ago at the UTS event. Philip was here today. He's already thinking about bundling blue and green infrastructure. Even before he was invited to join the committee 18 months ago, John was already formulating ideas. So I think he's someone you're going to hear a lot more from, and you're going to hear a lot more from the Planning Institute of Australia, advocating along with Engineers Australia and other national bodies for the bundling of blue and green infrastructure. Ecosystem services and WSID, water sensitive urban design. Who would have thought? Some of these things, there hasn't been a nationally accepted definition. So among all the things that we've looked at, we've actually recognised those things such as ecosystem services and water sensitive urban design, because there's been lots of talk about it, but there hasn't actually been a nationally accepted go-to place that defines what they are, and that's what the handbook's done. We would also like to see, obviously, economic values and co-benefits. Co-benefits was a word that I worked very hard to get into the Australian Climate Change Adaptation Standard, because it's not just climate change alone that you would need to do urban greening. I know Dr. Kim's here today, and that wonderful talk, just the co-benefits to health, even without climate change and heat. These things are delivering benefits, measurable benefits every day of the year. So I think the whole concept of measurable benefits and getting asset class recognition is very key. It sounds pretty boring and dry, but I can say it's very critical. There's people on the, I work with investment analysts who are on the sustainability reference group at my local council, and I say, why do you bother coming to this sort of thing? But he's really fascinated about looking at some of the sustainability challenges through local government, but he's in S&P and he's looking at trends in investment. So we need to have more of these linked up conversations beyond the people in the room. It's great that the planners and engineers and medical people here today, but we do need to really mainstream these conversations. Scalability is another thing that we need to talk about, and I'll show you some diagrams, because we'll have conversations like we did last week where you'll have someone in the sector wanting to talk about an individual tree managing as an asset, but then that same person is actually responsible for a system of 50,000 trees. So we can have conversations about green infrastructure at all sorts of different scales. I think that Philip Grouse's presentation was a really good example of a precinct-wide discussion. We've had technical session just before this session, looking at down to the detail of a tree vault and soil volumes just being as critical, but we've also got to jump up to a macro level as well. So I think we were talking then about, look, here's the council doing a lot of work with Institute of Landscape Architects around UV protection. So Dr. Kim reinforced this whole issue around shade and UV, and who would have thought that even in the middle of winter you're going to have issues with you need UV protection in the middle of winter. So that has been a whole continuing professional development program that's been running at New South Wales level that's about to go national. So you'll be really pleased to see that, and maybe we should get Doctors for the Environment on board with that, as well as the Cancer Council. I think during COVID-19, we saw just the benefits of what does having locally accessible, high-value green infrastructure. We know that it brings those benefits. So I guess COVID was a bit of a wake-up call, just after another tipping point event, just after the almost 50-degree day in Penrith. But similarly, I think the pandemic told us that there's a lot of values to green infrastructure that weren't necessarily appreciated until these shock events occur. So resiliency to hotter and drier climates, that's really been the key thing about today. But of course, there are many other benefits that we need to look at, and certainly in the cost-benefit analysis and looking at the multiple benefits of green infrastructure, that's something that the future unfinished parts of the handbook are going to address. This has been going on for a long time. This was about 6 or 7 years ago. It's now emerged into Greener Spaces, Better Places. This is Hort Innovation Australia funding this program. So there's the industry awareness is there. There's been a lot of marketing and talking. We know, again, urban forestry, etc. But of course, one of the things about the handbook was trying to also deal with all this new language. We know that some people say, well, what's green grid? What's urban forestry? They're actually generic forms of green infrastructure strategies. So we're trying to lay down here definitions. There was no definition of a green roof or a green wall or a green facade. There are people in this industry that are trying to mainstream these new forms of micro green infrastructure, and they're really challenged at the moment because there hasn't been a nationally accepted definition of what they do. So we've actually attempted to do that. It's not a technical definition. We could certainly have talked about now opening up the door. So there's a new group called the Australasian Green Infrastructure Network, which is just emerging if you want to Google it and join it. And they want to sort of become a national advocacy body. And they're very interested in taking the handbook and maybe developing technical standards for things like green facades, green walls, green roofs. We've talked about rain gardens and bioswales. There's a lot of jargon in our industry. And if you're not working in the industry every day, it can be quite confusing. So again, the role of the handbook was for people who might be new to the sector, that they could pick it up and flip through a very short publication and really get their head around it. And the scalability diagrams, and talking about Philip Grouse's diagrams as well, that we're looking at 3 scales of green infrastructure, that we can be having a discussion about settlements, which is the term for urban. We don't say towns and cities, they call it settlements, but they can be a town or they can be a whole of city. And we did some diagrams like this, so you can see that it's recognising the importance of urban riparian corridors. We heard a lot from Phil about South Creek and went about a creek. This is not of any particular place, it's just a theoretical idea of what green grid or urban forestry, how it fits into that scale of thinking. We're also addressing, future release areas and greenfields, peri-urban issues of where we're seeing tree loss in these sort of fringe peri-urban areas. If we go to the next scale, we zoom into the yellow, start again, the red circle. And this would be what we'd call precinct. We're starting to look at systems a little bit closer in, and developers are often working at the scale, or consultants. I know that probably from the last discussion, some councils are starting to look at precinct strategies. So we can look at it at that scale. And if you look at the last red circle, there are some people that are in the urban green infrastructure space, and they just really have conversations at this level. And they're the people that are pushing some of the new, where trees actually aren't, there's no space left for trees in certain density settings like Sydney Olympic Park where I work. If you go to Singapore, you're looking at new forms of green infrastructure such as green facades, green walls, green roofs. This is the planning framework the slide the diagram that was provided by John Brockhoff. So this is sort of touch points at a very generic level. And, if you're into planning, I know that talking to some of my planning colleagues, you might enjoy this section. It's been written for planners. This work was done in the decision-making area by Sebastian Fausch, and it starts to break down the different types of, principles and strategies and process. So some ownership of whether it's private sector, whether it's public sector, and there's basically 8 streams of green infrastructure. There's descriptions and principles and process that are provided for each one in a generic sense, and they're really to help people who are unclear about what to do with existing green infrastructure, or maybe they're making plans for new ones. It has a very broad outline process on how to tackle these different forms of green infrastructure. This slide is just acknowledging the people and the diversity of what I call the linked up conversations. You can see, the various skill sets that went into the committee are very broad, and I think that as evidenced today and what I was intending 10 days ago, we need to really broaden out the conversations even more. We need to have stronger representation with the health sector, because we know that we can bring a lot of avoided health costs and benefits to the budget bottom line, especially in the public health spend. Equally, we're looking at big transport, but we've got to keep on engaging with the scientists. We've got to keep on looking at the latest science, the latest research. It's got to be data-based, and we're increasingly wanting to get more involvement from the planning and engineering professions. The bits of the project that were not unfortunately able to be completed due to the lack of trying to get a national accepted section on valuing green infrastructure. Having said that, there's been some really excellent work done by New South Wales Government. I was on the perimeter of this project. It's called the Valuing Green Infrastructure and Public Spaces Framework, that's now gone to New South Wales Treasury. You can download that document, and it looks at probably what needs to go up to the national level. There's probably about 8 different ways of measuring the cost benefits, and that's something that really could be elevated quite quickly up to a national level to finish off the handbook sections that we couldn't find volunteer environmental consultants. So if anyone knows any environmental consultants that are really keen to make a contribution at the national level, please come and see me. And finally, where are we going with this? Well, this has cheekily been put together by Dr. Sebastian Fausch and a bit of artificial intelligence. I don't think it's ChatGPT, but we had a discussion in our dinner in January, and Sebastian has been posting, if you follow Sebastian Fausch on LinkedIn, he'd been posting some AI-generated images of green cities, and we said, well, what happens if we put in biophilic Brisbane 2032, nature positive? And this is what the Sebastian Fausch's intelligence and the artificial intelligence machine that he was working with generated. So I think that is the Brisbane skyline. I think that might be the Brisbane River, but this is what came out of the other end. Interestingly enough, the Queensland Government infrastructure strategy doesn't recognise or define green infrastructure. So there you go. That's why the National Handbook can be very useful to say, hey, not only federal government, but even the Queensland State Government. We had the 5th Estate Urban Greening event 10 days ago. We're now having this wonderful event today. Thank you again to Ben. We want to complete the unfinished business of the cost-benefit tools and getting asset class recognition. That would be the home run. I think we got to third base. And of course, look, other partners as well as Westrock and Citygreen and Penrith, at the national level, the policy, this document's been supported strongly by the Planning Institute. AILA will continue to promote it. Hort Innovation Australia, we want to get Engineers Australia on board. And as I said, Australian Green Infrastructure Network is emerged after this document came out. So I don't think you're going to see the advocacy for urban green infrastructure go away. I think if anything, it's going to get louder and more effective. And I have to say thank you to Ben for hosting today. It's been a pleasure.